The dust lifted in lazy spirals off the prairie at sunset, turning the whole sky the color of a week-old bruise. The air tasted of alkali and horse sweat, and the heat still clung to the earth even as shadows stretched long across the packed dirt road leading into Sable Junction. A freight wagon rattled to a stop, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against stone, and a chorus of rough laughter spilled out from the bed, where half a dozen ranch hands lounged against sacks of grain and coiled rope. Lillian stepped forward from the shadow of the Haymaker Saloon, her calico dress torn at the shoulder and the fabric faded to a ghostly pink. She folded her arms across her chest and lifted her chin, the gesture practiced and precise, though the bruises blooming along her jaw were fresh purple, turning to yellow at the edges. Her dark hair hung loose, tangled with dust, and her eyes gray as winter sky held something that might have been defiance if you didn't look too close. They say no man in 3 counties could walk away from me, she said, her voice carrying just the right note of playful challenge, though the words tasted like ash. The smile that followed was the kind those men paid to see wide and knowing. The men hooted and whistled. One of them, a heavy-shouldered brute with a beard like wire brush, leaned forward grinning. "That's so darlin' well. We got coin enough to test that claim." Lillian's smile didn't waver, though her fingers tightened against her ribs, pressing into the bruise there that throbbed with each breath. She opened her mouth to deliver the next line when movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the heat shimmer, walking steady and unhurried. At first, he seemed part of the landscape itself, but as he drew closer, the details resolved a Lakota warrior, tall and lean, his dark hair braided tight and bound with leather cord, a bone choker at his throat, catching the dying light. He wore canvas trousers and a faded shirt, nothing ceremonial, but there was something in the way he moved, economical, aware, that made the laughter die by degrees. At his hip rode a well-kept Colt Navy revolver. He stopped 10 paces from the wagon and looked at Lillian, once a single measuring glance that took in the torn dress, the bruises, the way she held herself too straight. Then his gaze moved past her to the men. "Back away," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "She's not a game." He angled his body between her and the wagon, one hand hanging open at his side palm, down a quiet command. The ranch hands stared. One spat into the dirt. Another reached for the iron at his belt. The heavy-shouldered man stood up in the wagon bed, swaying slightly. "You got some business here, Indian." The warrior Takala, though Lillian didn't know his name yet, didn't answer immediately. He simply waited still as stone. When he finally spoke, it was with the kind of patience that comes from watching storms cross the plains. "I do now," he said. And the first crack of gunfire split the evening air. 2 weeks earlier, Sable Junction had looked to Lillian Caldwell like the answer to a prayer she hadn't quite finished praying. The town sprawled along a single rutted street, bookended by 2 saloons, with a telegraph shack hunched between them and a communal pump that coughed more air than water. The buildings were raw pine and tar paper, their angles not quite square, and the whole place had the temporary feel of something built to last just long enough to be abandoned. She'd arrived on the afternoon stage from Wildflower, her worldly possessions tied in a carpet bag that smelled of lavender and fading hope. The mail-order advertisement had been specific respectable marriage to Mr. Edgar Harmon, gentleman rancher of good standing, seeking wife of good character and sturdy constitution. The handwriting had been neat, the promises modest but sincere, and the letter that followed had included $20 for stage fare. What she found at the depot was not a groom, but a smiling fixer named Blackjack Rusk, dressed in a checkered vest and a silk tie that had seen better days. He'd tipped his hat and introduced himself as Mr. Harmon's business associate, apologizing profusely for the gentleman's absence. Urgent matters at the ranch, terribly sorry. But accommodations had been arranged at the Haymaker Saloon, until the wedding could be properly organized. Lillian had felt the first cold finger of doubt trace her spine. But she'd also traveled 300 miles on borrowed money and had nowhere else to go. No family to return to after what had happened in St. Louis, the scandal that had destroyed her prospects and her reputation in one brutal evening. She'd been a seamstress in a respectable house, trusted and valued, until the merchant's son had cornered her in the storage room and torn her dress. She'd fought him off, left him bleeding from where she'd raked her scissors across his cheek. But when his father demanded an explanation for the wound, the boy had lied. Said she'd tried to seduce him, then attacked him when he refused her advances. The merchant's word against a seamstress with no family and no protection. The constable had given her 24 hours to leave the city before filing charges for assault. So she'd fled west on a mail-order promise, because women with ruined reputations had precious few choices. Blackjack led her upstairs to a narrow room with a rope bed and a window overlooking the back alley. The door had a lock, and he made a show of handing her the key. "Just temporary," he'd assured her. "Mr. Harmon will send word any day now." But Mr. Harmon never sent word. Instead, Blackjack returned the next morning with a different proposition light work downstairs serving drinks and making conversation a way to earn her keep until the wedding arrangements were finalized. Nothing improper, he assured her. Lillian, whose funds had dwindled to 3 coins and a brass button, agreed. The first night was easy enough. The second night was harder. By the end of the first week, she understood with drowning clarity that the wedding was a lie, that Mr. Harmon didn't exist, and that the debt Blackjack claimed she owed for room board the stage fare he'd advanced was designed to grow faster than she could ever pay it down. She learned the line that kept her from a beating. "They say no man in 3 counties could walk away from me. If the customers believed it, they tipped better. If they tipped, she could eat." Sable Junction was dying. The Eagle Fork Creek, which fed the town's single pump and watered the struggling crops, had dwindled to a trickle over the past year. The reason was no secret Lightning Bill Varner, the ranch boss who controlled half the territory, had built a timber dam upriver to fatten his herds and starve everyone else into selling their land for pennies. Into this brittle world rode Tokala, though he didn't announce himself. He arrived with 2 companions from the Wind River Agency, Eastern Shoshone country, leading pack mules loaded with hides to trade. The boys on the street called him Whispering Fox and kept their distance, spreading rumors that he was a horse thief, a murderer. Bounty posters still circulated with his face sketched in crude charcoal, offering $50 for his capture. The charge: conspiracy to murder during a cattle roundup near Arrowhead Pass. But the truth was different, and Tokala carried it like stones in a sack. 5 years ago, he'd been hired to scout for a legitimate cattle drive. His younger brother, Setan, 17 and still believing himself immortal, had come along to learn the trade. The drive was ambushed by rustlers in a narrow canyon. Tokala had been on point, heard the first shots, and ridden back to find 3 cowhands dead and his brother bleeding out from a gut wound. Setan had lived long enough to whisper what he'd seen Lightning Bill Varner meeting with the rustlers the night before, handing over money and maps. The ambush wasn't random, it was planned. Varner wanted the cattle and needed scapegoats. Tokala had tracked the rustlers for 2 days, found their camp, seen Varner's brand on their horses. But before he could report it, the posters went up with his face. Varner had bought witnesses, paid off the law, and transformed Tokala from witness to wanted man. Setan died in his arms, and Tokala learned that justice was something white men sold to the highest bidder. He'd been running ever since, unable to clear his name, unwilling to stop trying. Tokala kept to himself in Sable Junction, speaking only when necessary, sleeping outside town under the cottonwoods. But he noticed things. He noticed the water table dropping. He noticed Quincy, the telegraph runner, refusing to send certain wires and looking over his shoulder. He noticed the freight wagons rolling in after dark with cargo hidden under tarpaulin. And he noticed Lillian. The first time he saw her, she was behind the haymaker at dusk, leaning against the rain barrels and rubbing her wrists where rope had left marks. She was muttering to herself, practicing that line. They say no man in 3 counties could walk away from me, over and over, until her voice broke. Takala had started to turn away when a ranch hand stumbled out and cornered her. The man was drunk, his hands insistent, and Lillian's protests were tired automatic. Takala stepped into the lamplight. "Let her pass." The ranch hand sneered. "Mind your business, Indian." Takala didn't move. He just stood there, patient and still, until the man's sneer faltered and some deeper instinct made him back off swearing. Lillian looked at Takala, her face naked with exhaustion and surprise, before schooling it back into brightness. "Thanks, I suppose." "Drink." Takala held out his canteen. She took it carefully, avoiding his fingers, and drank longer than she meant to. "Thank you," she said again, quieter, and this time it sounded real. Takala nodded once and walked away. It was a small thing, barely worth remembering. But it stuck. Over the next week, Takala kept watch. He saw Quincy slipping notes to Dr. Demetrius Hale, an abolitionist who'd stayed after the war, to Dr. Miners and cowhands. He saw Charlotte Hart, the schoolteacher, hauling buckets from the creek at dawn before school. And he saw the freight wagons heard sounds from under the tarps that might have been cargo or might have been something else. When Quincy finally approached him outside the telegraph office, hands shaking and a copied ledger tucked under his coat, Takala knew the wrongness had a name. "I copied it," Quincy whispered, opening the ledger. "Payments, from Lightning Bill Varner to Blackjack Rusk, routed under a shipping code." Takala scanned the columns of numbers and dates. "What's the code for deliveries?" Quincy said, choking on the word. He flipped the page, revealing a list of names, ages, places of origin. All women. They bring them in on mail-order promises, brides for men who don't exist, then put them to work or ship them south to mining camps. Black Jack handles the recruiting. Lightning Bill provides the wagons and muscle. Takala's jaw tightened. How many? 4 new ones came in last night, hidden under tarpaulin. They're in the barn behind the haymaker, locked in until morning. At dawn, they load them up and move them to Rattlesnake Bar, then south. "You did right to show me," Takala said. "Keep that safe. I'll need it later." He left Quincy and headed for the haymaker. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and fear. Takala slipped inside through loose boards, moving silent. He heard them before he saw them, quiet, weeping the creak of rope against wood. 4 women sat bound to support posts, gags in their mouths, eyes wide with terror when he materialized from darkness. He crouched in front of the nearest one and pulled a knife. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "You understand?" The woman nodded frantically. He cut the ropes with quick strokes and moved to the next. When all 4 were free, he gestured toward the back. "Go quiet. Head for the creek and follow it east until you find the cottonwoods. Hide there until morning. Someone will find you." They hesitated, searching his face for the trap, the price. Finding none, they slipped out into the night. Takala scattered the cut ropes and overturned a lantern, making it look like panicked breakout rather than deliberate rescue. Then he went looking for Lillian. He found her packing her carpet bag with shaking hands. She looked up when he appeared, her face flooding with shock and wild emotions. "How did you?" "Doesn't matter." He stepped inside and closed the door. "At dawn, they take you. Quincy showed me the list. Your name's on it." Lillian's face went white. "I thought I had more time. I thought—" "There's no more time," Takala said. "I cut the others loose. They're at the creek. You need to be there too. And then what? Lillian demanded. Run where Lightning Bill owns half the territory. Black Jack has contacts everywhere. I don't know yet, Takala admitted. But staying here means you're on that wagon at dawn. So you choose take your chances with me, or take your chances with them. Lillian stared at him, searching for lies or broken promises. What she found was stark honesty, a man who'd made a decision and would see it through. She grabbed her bag. The Cottonwoods. I'll be there. Good. Takala turned to leave, then paused. When it goes loud tomorrow, run. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Just run. I'm not helpless, Lillian said sharply. I know. Takala met her eyes. But you're also not bulletproof. So when I say run, you run. He left before she could argue, and Lillian stood alone, heart pounding. She thought about the merchant's son in St. Louis, the lies that had destroyed her, the smile Black Jack had worn when he'd steered her into this trap. She thought about Tokala's canteen, offered without asking for anything in return. Then she climbed out the window and ran for the creek. Dawn came fast and loud. The freight wagon sat outside the haymaker and Lightning Bill's men gathered around it, six-armed, laughing, passing a flask. Black Jack directed loading with sharp words. Except the women weren't in the barn. Black Jack discovered this when his men came back empty-handed reporting cut ropes and an open door. His face went dark and he barked orders, search the alleys, check the creek, find them. Which was when Lillian stepped into the street. She walked slowly, deliberately, her torn dress catching the light chin high. That bright smile was back. Looking for me, boys. Black Jack's scowl melted into a grin. Where you been, darlin'? We got a schedule to keep. I know, Lillian said, still smiling, though it felt like her face might crack. I just needed a moment to freshen up. Black Jack studied her with suspicious eyes, but the other men relaxed, convinced she'd come back on her own. One of them, a wiry fellow with a scar across his nose, grabbed her elbow, fingers digging in hard. Come on, then. Into the wagon. Lillian's smile didn't falter. This was the plan, be the bait. Keep their eyes on her, give Takala the opening he needed. Then Takala stepped into the street. He came from the telegraph shack, moving slow and unhurried palms, opened the Colt Navy still holstered. He just walked toward them like a man crossing a field, except every line of his body was coiled tight. Back away, he said quietly. She's not going with you. The ranch hands stopped laughing. Black Jack turned slowly. You again. Should have known. You got a death wish, Indian. Maybe, Takala said, still walking forward. But you're gonna honor it before I do. The man holding Lillian shoved her toward the wagon and reached for his gun. Takala moved. He pivoted, pulled a hidden blade, and slashed the wagon's hitch in one smooth motion. The leather parted with a snap, and the startled horse bolted, dragging the wagon forward in a lurch that sent men tumbling. By thunder, get him! Someone yelled, and gunfire cracked. Takala grabbed Lillian's wrist and pulled her behind the communal pump as bullets chewed splinters from the frame. She hit the ground hard, but Takala was already moving, shoving her toward the gap between buildings. Move! They ran along the back of the buildings, Takala always on the windward side, his body between her and the street. A bullet whined past, and another punched through his sleeve and grazed his forearm. He grunted but didn't slow. Lillian saw the blood bright against his shirt, and her stomach lurched. You're hit. Keep running. A rifle boomed from across the street, Finn the farmer covering them with careful shots. Go. They reached the corrals, and Tokala vaulted the fence, grabbed a Grula mare, and swung up bareback. He reached down for Lillian, who took his hand, and let him haul her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the heat of him, the hard muscle and tremor of exertion. The mare danced nervously, and Tokala steadied her with his knees before kicking her into a gallop. Behind them, men shouted and fired, but the distance grew with each stride. They thundered east along the rail bed, following the dying creek, and didn't stop until the town was a smudge on the horizon. Tokala pulled the mare to a halt in the shade of a cut bank. He slid down, breathing hard, and Lillian dismounted immediately. "Let me see," she said, reaching for his arm. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. Sit down." Tokala sat surprised by her tone, and Lillian tore a strip from her dress hem and tied it tight around his forearm. Her fingers were quick and sure. "You've done this before," Tokala observed. "My father was a farrier," Lillian said, concentrating, "before he drank himself to death. He taught me to wrap a wound." She pulled the knot tight, and Tokala hissed, but didn't pull away. "There, that'll hold." "Thank you." Lillian looked up, their faces suddenly close. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she sat back and let out a shaky breath. "What now?" "Now we keep moving," Tokala said. "Lightning Bill won't stop. If word gets out that someone freed his cargo and lived, his whole operation falls apart. So he'll hunt us. He'll try." Lillian laughed bitterly. "You really know how to make a girl feel safe." Tokala almost smiled. "You want safe, you picked the wrong escort." "Apparently so." But she didn't move away. They followed the rail bed east toward Wildflower, keeping to low ground where the cut bank offered cover. The mare was steady, and Tokala let her pick the pace, trusting her instincts. Twice that first day, riders appeared on the ridgeline silhouettes, scanning the flats with rifles. Twice Tokala sent Lillian down into the cattails while he lay flat atop the bank with his revolver-drawn son behind him. He didn't fire. He just waited until the riders' horses grew skittish and the men turned back. Each time Lillian climbed out with mud on her skirts, and Tokala offered his hand without a word. On the second climb, her boot slipped, and he caught her wrist, steadying her until she found footing. Their eyes met his dark and level, hers wide and running on fear, and something passed between them, wordless and understanding. By late afternoon, they reached a bend where cottonwoods offered shade and the water ran clear. Tokala checked the mare's hooves, while Lillian knelt at the water's edge and splashed her face. When she looked up, Tokala held out jerky and hardtack. "Not much, but it's what I have." Lillian took it and bit into the jerky, chewing slowly. It was tough and salty and tasted like survival. "You always carry provisions." "Always. Learned that the hard way." "How?" He glanced at her, weighing the question. "Long time ago, I got stranded in the Badlands without water. Thought I knew the country better than I did. Took 3 days to find a spring. By then, I was seeing things that weren't there." "What kind of things?" "My brother." The words came out flat, but there was old pain underneath. "He died years before. But I saw him anyway, standing on a ridge, waving me forward. I followed until I realized I was walking in circles." Lillian studied him, seeing the lines around his eyes, the scars on his knuckles. "What happened to him?" "Roundup went bad. Rustlers hit the drive near Arrowhead Pass." Tokala's jaw tightened. "But it wasn't random. Lightning Bill Varner paid them. My brother saw the exchange, tried to tell me. Took a bullet in the gut for it." He paused, the memory sharp. "Satan was 17. Died in my arms, whispering what he'd seen Varner handing over money and maps. The ambush was planned. Varner wanted the cattle and needed someone to blame." His voice went hard. "Posters went up with my face before I could report what Satan told me. Varner bought witnesses, paid off the law, turned me from witness to wanted man." Lillian's breath caught. "So you've been running ever since?" "Yeah, He didn't say more, and she didn't push. They ate in silence, the only sounds cottonwood leaves rustling and a distant hawk calling. When they finished, Takala checked his revolver, reloading spent chambers with steady hands. Lillian watched, fascinated by the economy of his movements. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "I know which end the bullet comes out of. Beyond that, not much." Takala almost smiled. "That's a start." He held out the spare cylinder, preloaded and capped. "Here, hold this." Lillian took it, feeling the weight. Takala guided her hands into position, showing her how to support it with her palms. "Hands here." He instructed, his fingers briefly covering hers. "If I have to reload fast, I'll need you to pass it steady. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, and Lillian felt something shift between them. Not attraction exactly, but the beginning of trust. That night, they made camp by Wind River, where the water ran wide and the trees grew thick. Takala built a careful fire using dry wood that burned with almost no smoke, and set a tripwire of thin cord around the perimeter. Lillian sat close to the coals, hugging her knees against the evening chill. She'd cleaned the graze on Takala's arm earlier with whiskey, her breath held close, hair falling forward. The work had been intimate in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with trust he'd held still, and she'd been careful not to hurt him more than necessary. "Why did you do it?" she asked, suddenly staring into the fire. "Risk everything for me for those other women. You don't know us." Takala was silent for a long moment, staring at the flames. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called lonesome and high. Lillian shivered, and without looking, Takala shifted his blanket so the edge lay closer to her side. "Because they shouldn't have you," he said finally. "Any of you. That's reason enough." Lillian turned to look at him, but he was still watching the fire. She wanted to understand what kind of man walked into gunfire for strangers. What code or conscience drove someone to risk their life for people who couldn't repay it? But the words stuck. So instead, she inched closer to the coals, then closer still, until his blanket edge brushed her shoulder. He noticed his breathing changed slightly, but he didn't move away. They sat that way until the fire burned low and exhaustion dragged them under two people bound by necessity and something neither had words for yet. On the second day, the sky turned ugly. By afternoon, the temperature dropped, and by evening, a freak spring storm rolled in from the high peaks, not snow exactly, but freezing rain mixed with sleet that cut like glass and turned the ground treacherous. They were in the high country by then, where the land turned rocky and severe. Takala spotted a shallow cave carved into the cliff face, barely more than a deep overhang, but enough to keep them out of the worst of it. "In there," he said, sliding off the mare and leading her toward shelter. Inside the cave was dry, but cramped, perhaps 8 feet deep and barely wide enough for 2 people and a horse. Takala tied the mare at the entrance, where she could get some protection, but still access the sparse grass, then gestured Lillian deeper inside. The temperature plummeted as darkness fell. The freezing rain became sleet, then hail that hammered the rocks like gunfire. Takala built a small fire near the cave mouth, just enough to warm them without smoking them out, and spread his blanket. "We'll have to share," he said matter-of-factly. "Cold like this, we need to pool warmth." Lillian nodded, too cold to argue propriety. They sat close, the blanket wrapped around both their shoulders, and for a while there was only the sound of ice hammering stone. "In St. Louis," Lillian said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "There was a merchant's son. He cornered me in the storage room where I worked as a seamstress, tried to force himself on me." Her voice went flat. I fought back, raked my scissors across his face, left him bleeding. Takala stayed silent, listening. His father demanded an explanation for the wound. The boy lied, said I'd tried to seduce him, then attacked him when he refused. She laughed bitterly. The merchant's word against a seamstress with no family, no protection. The constable gave me 24 hours to leave before filing charges for assault. She pulled the blanket tighter. So I fled. Saw that advertisement, thought maybe I could start over where nobody knew. Turns out, I just traded one trap for another. No, Takala said quietly. You survived. That's not nothing. Lillian looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. You don't think I'm ruined, damaged goods. I think you're a woman who refused to be broken when most people would have given up. He met her eyes. That takes more courage than most men I know possess. Something in Lillian's chest loosened a knot she hadn't realized was there. Thank you, she whispered. They sat in silence for a while, the cold pressing in. Then Tokala spoke, his voice rough. When Sitan died, he was trying to tell me something. Kept whispering Varner's name, trying to make me understand what he'd seen. Tokala's jaw worked. I told him to save his strength, that we'd get him to a doctor. But he knew he was dying. Used his last breath to give me the truth. His hands clenched. And I couldn't do anything with it. Couldn't clear his name or mine. Couldn't bring the men who killed him to justice. For 5 years I've been running, and every day I wake up knowing I've failed him. You didn't fail him, Lillian said fiercely. You survived. You kept going when they tried to break you. That's what he'd want. Takala looked at her, then really looked, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. The realization that they'd both been shaped by violence and lies, but refused to let it define them completely. The cold drove them closer. They lay down side by side, the blanket pulled over both of them, sharing warmth out of necessity. Their faces were inches apart in the darkness, breath mingling in the small space. Takala, Lillian whispered. Thank you. For seeing me. Not what those men wanted me to be, but who I actually am. His hand found hers under the blanket, fingers lacing together. Same to you. They fell asleep that way, the storm raging outside, but inside the cave, for the first time in years, both of them felt something like safety. By the third day, they'd reached Ember Ridge, where the land turned rocky and pine-covered. Takala was teaching Lillian to read the country, how to spot water by the vegetation, how to tell if they were being followed by the way birds behaved, how to move quietly. Watch the ground, he said. Step where it's solid rock or packed earth. Avoid dry branches. Lillian followed his lead, stepping carefully. Then she froze. Takala, wait. He stopped immediately, hand moving toward his revolver. What? There. She pointed to a patch of disturbed earth partially hidden by brush. Hoof prints. Fresh. Takala crouched, examining them. His eyebrows rose slightly. Good eye. 2 horses, maybe 3 hours ahead. He glanced at her with something that might have been approval. You learn fast. Had a good teacher, Lillian said, and despite the danger she felt a flush of pride. They gave the trail a wide berth and circled around. That afternoon, they spotted the ramshackle company office tucked into a hollow abandoned windows, dark. We need supplies, Takala said. The mare needs grain. They approached carefully. The office was empty, thick with dust and mouse droppings. In the back room, they found a locked tack shed that yielded to Takala's knife, revealing saddles, blankets, a barrel of oats, and a sack of cornmeal. Takala hoisted the sack, But Lillian called from the main office, her voice tight. "Tokala, you need to see this." He returned to find her holding a packet of papers, her face bloodless. "Marriage contracts," she said, hands shaking. "All signed by women coming west, all routed through Blackjack Rusk." She shuffled through them. "This one's mine." Tokala took the packet and scanned it. The handwriting was neat and formal. The groom's name was Mr. Edgar Harmon, but stamped across the bottom in red ink, processed by Q. Mallory, Agent Eagle Fork Freight, authorized by W. Varner, Principal. "Q. Mallory," Tokala said. "Quiet Quentin, Lightning Bill's foreman." "He signed them all," Lillian said hollowly. "Mr. Harmon doesn't exist. Never did." Tokala flipped to the next page and froze. It was a telegraph draft never sent header reading confirmation of recovery collateral transfer authorization. Below was a list of names and debts. Halfway down, L. Caldwell, recovery facilitated via T. Red Elk, bounty claim $50 plus commission on collateral sale. Lillian snatched the paper, reading it twice, eyes widening. "They were using me to get to you," she breathed. "The advertisement at the marriage promise, it was all bait, to lure you into town." Tokala's jaw tightened. Lightning Bill wanted the bounty. Knew I'd notice someone in trouble and step in. Same play as Arrowhead Pass, set up the situation, let it unfold, pin it on me. "So, I'm just bait," Lillian said, her voice breaking. "A tool. Something to be used and thrown away." "No." Tokala's voice was hard, final. He took the papers from her shaking hands and met her eyes. "You're a person who got caught in a trap meant for me, which makes this my fault, not yours. My responsibility." "That's not..." "It is." His intensity made her breath catch. "But it also means we know the game now. We know what Lightning Bill's planning. We can turn it around." Lillian stared at him, her breathing slowing. Then she nodded once sharp. "Tell me what to do." "First, we get back to Eagle Fork," Tokala said, folding the papers carefully. "That's where the dam is. That's where Lightning Bill's leverage comes from. Take that away, we take away his power. And when he comes after us, and he will, we'll be ready. And if we die trying..." Tokala met her gaze, unflinching. "Then at least we die standing, not kneeling." Lillian let out a long breath, and then she smiled. Not the practiced, empty smile she'd worn in Sable Junction, but something real and raw and reckless. "I was a fool to come west on a mail-order promise," she said. "But I'll be damned if I die quietly. Let's burn it all down." They left the office with papers graying, and new purpose, no longer running from Lightning Bill's trap, but walking straight into it with eyes wide open. While Tokala and Lillian rode back toward Eagle Fork, Sable Junction was transforming. Quincy had taken the ledger copy to Dr. Hale, who'd shared it with Charlotte Hart. Together, they'd confronted Sheriff Bitter Sam, who dismissed them with contempt. So they'd gone another route, gathering the people Lightning Bill had hurt. Charlotte talked to farmers whose wells had run dry. Hale talked to townsfolk tired of paying Varner's prices for water. Quincy drafted wires and kept meticulous records. Within days, 24 people had assembled farmers' shopkeepers, even a few of Varner's former employees who'd finally had enough. They planned to hit the dam at dawn using blasting powder from the Yellowstone mine. Dr. Hale would place the charges. Charlotte would lead the western approach. Finn and the farmers would attack from the south, creating a distraction. It was desperate, thrown together from courage and necessity. But it was a plan. When Tokala and Lillian rode into the rebel camp 2 days later, Charlotte stood and embraced them both. "You're alive." "Barely," Tokala said. He handed her the papers from Ember Ridge. "Proof of what Lightning Bill's been doing." Charlotte scanned them, her face hardening. "This seals it. We move tomorrow at dawn." You need a distraction, Takala said. Lightning Bill's got guards on the dam and more at his ranch. If you just walk up and place charges, you'll be dead before you light the fuse. Which is why we're not alone, Charlotte said, gesturing to the assembled fighters. We've been gathering allies. Lillian stepped forward. Then let us help. Charlotte studied her, the torn dress, the bandaged feet, the fierce determination. You've already done more than anyone should have asked. No, Lillian said flatly. I was bait. I was used. Now I choose what I am, and I choose to fight. Charlotte looked at Takala, who nodded. All right, she said. Welcome to the rebellion. They planned through the night. Takala would take point with Lillian. His presence would draw Lightning Bill's attention. Charlotte would lead the western approach. Finn would attack from the south. Hale would place the charges while chaos reigned. Takala tried to convince Lillian to stay with the reserves. She rejected the idea with such vehemence that Charlotte intervened. She stays with you, Charlotte said. She's proven herself, and we need every gun. Takala wanted to argue, but looking at Lillian's face, at the determination there, the refusal to be sidelined, he recognized that arguing would accomplish nothing. Fine, he said. But you do exactly what I say when I say it. Same goes for you. Lillian shot back, and despite everything, a few farmers chuckled. They moved at dawn, the sky bruised with storm clouds rolling in from the west. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and the air smelled of ozone and coming violence. Takala, Lillian, and Hale approached from the north, moving low through scrub. They were 50 yards from the dam when the first shout went up. Lightning Bill's men had been waiting positioned along the approaches, and as Takala broke cover, they opened fire with disciplined precision. Bullets whined past, and Takala grabbed Lillian and dove behind a boulder as a rifle round shattered rock inches from her head. Blast it all, Takala swore. They knew we were coming. From the south, Finn's farmers engaged rifles, cracking, men shouting. From the west, Charlotte's group added their fire. The situation dissolved into desperate chaos. Rain began to fall slowly at first, then harder, turning the world into a gray curtain that made visibility guesswork. Lightning flashed overhead, thunder following almost instantly. Takala crouched behind the gatehouse at the dam's base, watching Hale work with shaking hands to position blasting charges against the sluice gate mechanism. The old doctor's face was set in concentration water streaming down. How long? Takala asked. 2 minutes to set it properly, Hale said. 30 seconds for the fuse if it stays dry. A whistle cut through Charlotte's signal. They were engaged. Lillian appeared beside Takala, Hale's spare revolver, gripped in both hands, barrel pointing safely down. Charlotte's signal. We need to move. Takala nodded and turned back to the field. Lightning Bill's men were everywhere, advancing in controlled rushes, professional and disciplined. These weren't ranch hands, and they were war veterans who knew tactics. Then riders appeared from Varner's ranch, a dozen strong, with Lightning Bill at the head. The ranch boss was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face like weathered leather. He rode straight back despite the rain. "Ain't nobody coming to save you," he roared. "You're all dead." Takala stood from cover, aimed carefully despite the rain, and fired 3 measured shots. One man fell, another's horse reared, and the charge faltered. A cart near the gatehouse caught fire, someone had thrown a torch, and flames roared despite the rain painting, everything orange and black. Charlotte appeared on the ridge with her Winchester firing methodically. Then one of Lightning Bill's men broke through and tackled Hale, knocking him from the charges. Takala lunged, slamming into the man and driving him against the wall. They grappled fists and elbows in desperation until Takala choked him unconscious and hauled Hale upright. "Do it?" Tokala shouted. "Light the fuse." Hale struck a match. It sputtered and died in the rain. He struck another, then another, hands shaking. Finally, one caught. He touched it to the fuse. The fuse sparked to life, hissing and spitting as rain tried to drown it. It burned for 5 seconds, 10, then sputtered halfway and died, leaving the powder inert. "No," Hale breathed. Lightning Bill saw it. He laughed, kicking his horse forward. "Told you this was pointless." But Tokala was already moving. He sprinted through rain toward the dam's ladder and began climbing toward the sluice gate mechanism, wooden rungs, slick and treacherous. Behind him, Lillian kept up covering fire, her shots wild but frequent enough to keep men ducking. She was down to her last 2 rounds when she saw movement on the rocks above Tokala, a sniper lining up a shot. For a heartbeat, she froze. Then Tokala's training kicked in. She couldn't hit the sniper at this distance, not accurately. But she could draw his attention. She stepped from cover, firing her last 2 rounds, not at the sniper, but at the rocks beside him, sending chips flying and a sharp crack echoing. The sniper jerked, startled, his aim spoiling. His shot went wide, missing Tokala by inches. The sniper swung his rifle toward Lillian, and she dove behind a boulder, with her heart slamming against her ribs, knowing she'd just saved Tokala's life, and gambling with her own. Tokala reached the platform above the gate, where a massive timber lever controlled the sluice. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled with everything he had. Nothing happened. He adjusted his grip, trying again, muscles straining until his vision blurred. The lever shifted a fraction, groaning, but the mechanism was rusted and the water pressure immense. A bullet struck near his foot. Another clipped his shoulder, not deep, but enough to make him grunt and lose his grip. "Tokala!" Lillian's scream cut through everything, raw and terrified. He looked down, meeting her eyes across the distance, and saw not just fear, but something deeper. In that moment, lightning struck close enough to smell burning metal, and in its flash, he saw her clearly exhausted and terrified, but standing her ground, because the alternative was abandoning him, and she wouldn't do that. Something inside him clicked into place, not just respect or gratitude, but something fiercer, more personal. He turned back to the lever with renewed determination. Charlotte appeared sprinting through rain with a fence post. She vaulted the ladder, and together they wedged the post under the lever. "On 3, Charlotte shouted. 1, 2, push." They threw their combined weight, and with a shriek of tortured metal, the sluice gate began to open. Water surged through a roaring wall, thundering down the channel and spreading across the parched valley. Lightning Bill saw it, and his face contorted with rage. "No, that's mine." He drove his horse toward where Lillian stood, reloading with fumbling fingers. She looked up, saw him coming, eyes going wide. "Lillian, move." Tokala shouted, but she was frozen between finishing the reload and running. In that fatal hesitation, Lightning Bill was on her. He leaned from the saddle and grabbed her hair, wrenching her head back. Lillian screamed, not in fear but fury, and slashed upward with her nails raking bloody furrows across his face. He bellowed, releasing her hair to grab her wrist instead, dragging her toward the spillway edge where water churned 30 feet below over rocks. "You cost me everything," he snarled, face inches from hers. "And now you're gonna pay." Lillian didn't beg. She remembered Tokala's training target, the joints. She twisted her body and kicked hard with both feet into Lightning Bill's knees. His legs buckled, and off balance on rain-slick stone at the edge, he stumbled backward. His hand shot out and caught her wrist in a crushing grip. For one terrible moment, they teetered together. Lightning Bill trying to use her weight to pull himself back. Lillian scrabbling with her free hand for anything to keep from being pulled over. Her fingers found a crack in the stone barely wide enough, and she clung with desperate strength even as her nails tore and blood slicked her grip. Tokala was running, vaulting down the ladder, but he was too far. Lightning Bill swung a fist toward Lillian's face, trying to dislodge her grip. Then Quiet Quentin appeared from nowhere, wielding an iron digging bar. His face twisted with terror and determination, and he swung the bar hard into Lightning Bill's back. The impact drove the air from the ranch boss's lungs. The pain broke Lightning Bill's concentration. Lillian wrenched her arm free with a savage twist that made her cry out. Tokala reached them a second later, grabbing Lillian around the waist and hauling her back from the edge. Lightning Bill unbalanced from Quentin's blow, and Lillian's wrench teetered on the very edge. Their eyes met Lightning Bill's, filled with hate and disbelief, Tokala's hard and unflinching. Then Lightning Bill lunged forward, knife appearing in his hand. Tokala didn't hesitate. He drew his Colt Navy and fired once. Lightning Bill Varner stumbled backward, lost his footing on the rain-slick stone, and tumbled over the edge into the churning spillway. The water took him under, and he did not surface. Tokala stood there. Lillian pressed against his chest, both breathing hard and shaking with aftermath. Behind them, the sluice gates continued pouring water into the valley. "It's done," Lillian said, barely audible over the roar. "It's really done." "It's done." Tokala agreed, and only then realized he was still holding her arms wrapped around her, like he couldn't quite believe she was real and safe. She didn't pull away. She turned in his arms until they were face-to-face, hands gripping his shoulders, and for a long moment they just stood there, in the pouring rain, looking at each other with expressions too raw to put into words. Then Charlotte was there, and Finn and Hale, and the moment passed as the world rushed back in. But something had changed between them, something fundamental and irreversible, and they both knew it. Dawn broke clear over Eagle Fork Valley, the storm having blown itself out. The creek ran full and strong, spreading through irrigation channels, and farmers watched the water come with tears cutting tracks through dust on their faces. At the dam, Bitter Sam lay bound in a wagon, hands tied, while Charlotte stood over him with the ledger. Quincy had spent the night drafting a wire to the territorial marshal, every word carefully chosen, every accusation documented. "I didn't have a choice," Bitter Sam muttered. "Lightning Bill paid my salary." "Your job," Charlotte said coldly, "was to uphold the law, not sell it." She turned to Finn. "Take him to Eagle Fork. Let the marshal sort him out." Quiet Quentin sat nearby, nursing a dislocated shoulder Hale had set. The foreman looked diminished, his hands shaking as he held weak coffee. "He made me do it," Quentin said desperately. "The contract's the codes. Lightning Bill said if I didn't sign, he'd frame me for theft." "You signed," Charlotte said flatly. "You made a choice. Own it." Quentin flinched, but nodded miserably. "I will. I swear I'll tell the marshal everything." Charlotte walked away and found Tokala and Lillian beneath the cottonwoods by the pump. They looked like they'd been through war, which they had, but they were alive and sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "The water's running," Charlotte said. "Finn opened the sluices. The farms will have what they need." "Good," Tokala said. Charlotte sat beside them, suddenly exhausted. "What will you do now?" Tokala glanced at Lillian, who was staring at the creek. "North, maybe. Wind River Agency. I have friends among the Eastern Shoshone there, folks who'd vouch for me." "You could stay," Charlotte said. "The valley needs honest men." "The valley needs water and law," Tokala said gently. "One it's got now. The other will come when the marshal arrives." "Not anymore." Charlotte pulled a folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. "Quincy sent a priority wire last night. The marshal replied this morning." Takala unfolded it and read the clipped cadences of a marshal's wire. Charges against Takala, Red Elk, dismissed. Stop witnesses recanted. Stop. All bounties void. Stop. Why? He finally managed. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because Lightning Bill needed you scared and running, Charlotte said quietly. Needed you to be the cautionary tale. But it's over now. You're free. Takala folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his shirt. Beside him, Lillian reached over and touched his hand, just a brush of fingers, but the gesture carried more weight than words. What about you? Charlotte asked Lillian. Lillian looked at her, then at Takala, then at the water running clear. I don't know. But wherever it is, it'll have a door that locks from the inside. Charlotte smiled sadly. Fair enough. By summer's end, Sable Junction had transformed. The pump ran steady. Charlotte's school enrollment doubled. Dr. Hale trained apprentices and wrote letters about quicksilver contamination at the Ember Ridge Mill, another fight for another day. A mutual irrigation association now held the water rights shares recorded at the county seat and governed by a rotating board. No single man would again hold the power to starve the valley. Lillian took a job at Finn's Dairy learning to milk cows and churn butter. She lived in a loft with a door that locked from the inside, and slowly the nightmares faded. Takala stayed too, though he never quite said why. He helped repair fences, taught Finn's boy to set snares ethically, and spent evenings with Lillian teaching her to read horses and land learning from her about poetry she'd memorized from her mother's books. He wore no ceremonial clothing. Those were for ceremony back home, not daily labor. Just plain shirts, canvas trousers, a simple headband. The bounty posters were gone, burned by Quincy before he'd left for St. Louis. But the story remained, passed along in whispers, and gradually transformed into legend. 3 months after the dam fight, 3 riders drifted into town. Hard men with hard eyes led by a scar-faced thug who wore his gun low. Price on your head's been doubled, the leader said, dismounting with a grin. Dead or alive Indian. The town gathered not in fear, but solidarity. Finn stepped out with his squirrel gun. Charlotte appeared with her Winchester. Hale came with a shotgun. Quincy's replacement emerged from the telegraph office holding a sealed document and read aloud. By order of the territorial marshal, all charges against Takala Red Elk are hereby dismissed. All bounties are void. Any attempt to pursue Mr. Red Elk will be prosecuted as kidnapping. The thug's grin faltered, but greed dies hard. He reached for his gun. He never cleared leather. Lillian stepped forward with the marriage contracts from Ember Ridge, reading them aloud, in a clear voice, naming names, dates, amounts, weaving together a pattern of conspiracy that implicated Rusk's entire network. The thug's hand froze. His eyes darted from papers to crowd, to his companions, who were already edging toward their horses. We can send for the marshal, Hale said calmly, shotgun steady. Or handle this here. Your choice. The thug looked at the armed townsfolk at Takala, standing quiet with his hand near his Colt Navy. He did the math: 3 men against a town, and self-preservation 1. He jerked his reins, trying to bolt. Takala was faster. He drew and fired once, clipping the man's hat brim. The horse reared. Takala fired again, cutting the stirrup strap. The man crashed to the ground. Take him, Takala said quietly, and the crowd moved forward, not a mob, but a community, binding his hands and hauling him toward the wagon. His companions didn't wait. They spurred their horses and left at a gallop, and nobody chased them. That night, by Wind River, Takala and Lillian walked the familiar path along the bank, where reeds whispered and stars wheeled overhead. They walked in comfortable silence until Lillian stopped and turned to face him. You didn't set out to save me, she said. No, Takala agreed. I set out to stop something wrong. You just happened to be part of it. And now, Now I don't aim to lose you." His vulnerability made it more question than statement. "If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you want to stay, I want to stay," Lillian said quietly. "I want to build that life we talked about, the one with horses and a door that locks from the inside and mornings that don't start with fear." She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, their fingers lacing together with natural ease. They stood that way for a long moment, breathing in time, warmth shared by choice rather than necessity, by desire rather than survival. "Wind River," Takala said eventually. "Spring, maybe, after winter passes. We'll take 2 horses. Finn said he'd sell us a breeding pair at fair price and whatever supplies we can carry. Start fresh." "Together," Lillian confirmed. "Together," he agreed. And there, beneath the cottonwoods with water running free and stars bearing witness, they made a promise not of marriage in the way white society counted such things, but of partnership, of building something together, from ruins, of facing whatever came next, side by side. The final surprise came with spring thaw. A lawyer from Eagle Fork rode into town with documents and a story that surprised everyone. Quiet Quentin Mallory, before he'd left, had drafted a will. In it, he'd left a small parcel of land near Wind River, 40 acres purchased years ago as investment to the Indian and the woman who had the courage to stand when everyone else was kneeling. The land wasn't much rough country, half timber and half grassland, with a spring that ran year-round and enough grazing for a small horse herd. But it was theirs, legal and clear. "I don't understand," Lillian said, staring at the documents. "Why would he do this?" "The letter he left said something about trying to do one thing right after doing so many things wrong," the lawyer explained. Charlotte wiped her eyes. "He was a coward most of his life. But at the end he found something worth being brave for. Maybe that's redemption enough." Takala and Lillian left Sable Junction in April as the prairie greened and wildflowers carpeted the valleys. They rode out on 2 sturdy horses' possessions, packed in saddlebags with letters from Charlotte and Hale tucked safely away. The town turned out to see them off. No speeches or grand gestures. Just gathering to watch as 2 people who'd arrived broken rode out whole, if not entirely healed. Charlotte pressed seeds into Lillian's hands for the garden they'd plant. Hale gave Takala a medical kit. Finn offered a handshake that turned into a brief, fierce hug. "You take care of each other," Charlotte said, both blessing and command. "We will," Lillian promised. They rode north and west, following old trails through country Takala knew from childhood, and Lillian was learning to love. They moved at an easy pace, stopping when they wanted camping under stars. One evening, as they made camp by a creek, Lillian looked at Takala across the fire and said what had been building in her chest for weeks. "I love you," she said simply. "I don't know when it started exactly. Maybe when you handed me that canteen, or when you stood between me and those men, or when you climbed that dam. But it's true, and I thought you should know." Takala looked at her for a long moment, firelight playing across his features, and something in his expression softened. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for a while. I love you too, not the way those men at the Haymaker thought love worked, where one person owns another, but the kind where we choose each other every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Lillian agreed and smiled, not the practiced, empty smile, but something real and warm and entirely her own. They reached Wind River 3 weeks later in late spring, when the land was at its most generous. The 40 acres sat in a valley sheltered by low hills, with the creek running along one border and pines climbing slopes. There was no house yet, just foundation stones of something someone had started and abandoned. But the land itself was good. They set up temporary camp and began the work of building not just a house, but a life. They built corrals and a small barn. They planted Charlotte's seeds and tended the garden. They learned each other's rhythms, discovered how to work together, figured out what it meant to be partners in the truest sense. It wasn't always easy. There were arguments over money and resources, moments of frustration when horses escaped or crops failed, nights when old nightmares resurfaced. But they worked through it together with honesty and patience and growing certainty that whatever challenges came, they'd face them as a team. By the following spring, they had a small herd of horses, only 6, but healthy and well-trained, and a house that was more than shelter. It was home. They had neighbors who'd welcomed them with cautious curiosity that warmed into friendship. They had work that paid honest wages and left them tired but satisfied. And they had each other, not saved, not rescued, but choosing daily to stand together, building something real and lasting from the ashes of broken promises and shattered dreams. On the anniversary of fleeing Sable Junction, Lillian and Tokala stood on a rise overlooking their land, watching the sunset in glory of orange and gold. Horses grazed peacefully below, and smoke rose from their chimney, carrying the smell of bread baking. "Do you ever regret it?" Lillian asked quietly. "Everything we went through." Tokala considered seriously. "I regret that people got hurt. I regret that it took violence to fix something that should never have been broken. But do I regret you this?" He gestured at the land, the horses, the life they'd built. "No, never." Lillian leaned against his shoulder, fitting herself against his side with easy familiarity. "Good. Because neither do I." They stood that way as the sun dropped below the horizon, and stars appeared, 2 people who'd survived the worst and come out not just alive, but truly free. Free from the past, free from others' expectations, free to build whatever future they could imagine together. And in the valley below, Wind River ran clear and cold and free, carrying their story forward into a future full of possibility and promise.